My name is William A. Reynolds. I was born November 15, 1921, in Spencerville, Ohio. Went all the way through school there and then went into service with the Ohio National Guard October 15, 1940. On Pearl Harbor, I was sitting on my bunk looking across at my friend who lived across the street from me. And he was to go home and be married in 2 or 3 days. And they announced on the radio, Pearl Harbor. That poor guy, he thought it was the end of the earth, But he got to go home and get married. He's still going strong, still my dearest friend. We were on duty at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and the colonel called over. Our regimental commander was in Mexico City on a conference, and my battalion commander, I was acting as his sergeant major, called over and said, "Get the plans." And I said, "We don't have any." He said, "Oh yeah, they gave them to us." Well, we don't have any. We were to go down and guard the bridges on the Gulf of Mexico. And I said to the colonel a couple of days later, I don't like this guarding bridges. I saw a thing where I could go to flying school as a flying sergeant. Would you approve it? He said, "Sure, get your papers together." A nice gent. I loved him every day since. And so I got my papers together and went off to flying school in March of 1942. Someone coming from civilian life into the service, they'd have a more difficult time than I had. And because they had to learn all of the protocol and all the commands and all that. Well, I knew all that. And all I had to do was fly the airplane. Also, down on the flight line, they'd see Sergeant, Staff Sergeant Bill Reynolds. And the old crew chief would come up, "Well, now watch this or watch that." They gave me a lot of help. And they didn't give it to those cadets. So I had a lot of help from the crew chiefs and the linemen on the line who, they liked that idea of having flying sergeants, you see. Of course, I got paid twice as much as the cadets did because I got flying pay. And so when we graduated from flying school in December in Georgefield, Illinois, that's right across the river from Vincennes, Indiana, we were made flight officers. That's a warrant grade. It's between a commissioned officer and enlisted personnel. And they have all the rights and privileges of officers, and they live with the officers. Their pay is almost the equivalent, I believe it is the equivalent of a second lieutenant. And then 5 months later, I was made a second lieutenant, and then went on from there. Then I stayed and flew in a gunnery school. We would get to fly. It was just like living in a country club. We had this resort city, little city, but and Fort Myers Beach is one of the most beautiful beaches in all the world, and Sanibel Island, and we stayed there, and we'd get to fly 2 or 3 different kinds of airplanes every day. It wasn't just one thing. It was just an exceptional place to be. We had PT-17s in primary, and we had BT-13s in basic. Then in advance, we were the first class into this field, George Field, Illinois. And we had AT-6s, which were single engine. We had AT-9s, which were a twin engine trainer made by Curtiss, which they called the Prostitute because it had such short wings, and they said there was no visible means of support. So they called it the Prostitute. We flew the AT-6s and the old B-26 Marauders and the Hudson Bombers and the Vega Venturas and the B-17s. And then we had several other kind of planes that we'd fly too. And I stayed there until they started putting the B-29 units together. And they wanted more experienced pilots. And the director of flying was a friend of mine, and I prevailed upon him as strong as I could. And so he let me go out. He said, they'll probably make you a co-pilot because you just barely have enough time. Well, I was fortunate enough I got to be an airplane commander and stayed as an airplane commander. They put the B-29 units together, and I was assigned to the 9th Bomb Group. And it was assembled and trained at over at McCook, Nebraska. And I go over there now as a representative of the 9th Bomb Group. They have a fall festival, the end of September every year. And I go over there as a representative of the 9th Bomb Group and march in the parade.
That's great.
They didn't have enough B-29s to train us, so prior to that, they took a number of crews and took us down to Pyote, Texas, Rattlesnake Army Air Base. And we finished our training there. They had B-29s, and we finished our training. Then, when it was in March before I got back over to my unit, there were a lot of problems with B-29s when they first came out because of the engines. They were the first airplanes, American-built airplanes at least, that had 2 banks of cylinders, and they had trouble cooling the back set of cylinders. And the first 10 times I ever flew a B-29, I only got back on the ground with all 4 engines running twice, the first 10 times. And we'd get engine fires too. So we had a lot of problem with them at first. And of course, so much of that, was just all pure luck. And if you were lucky, why, you had no problems. You got through it, and that's all there was to it. And I happened to be one of the lucky ones. Some of my friends weren't so fortunate. By the end of the war, every airplane we got was just a perfect airplane. Just perfect. Engines, everything was. See, it's an American production. They pushed them into production way ahead of time. And it just takes them a little while to get everything worked out. But they get it all worked out, and there are no bugs in it. Beautiful flying airplanes, safe. It was just a great airplane. They were just bigger and, of course, more powerful. They had those high-powered engines. We'd tease those. We'd see some, if we were testing an engine or something, have a new engine on, and we'd see a Navy fighter, and they weren't very good at altitude. They weren't made for high altitude. We'd get up behind them and then dive down and then pass them, Oh, and then you just see the smoke flying out of that thing. It was the last big airplane built that didn't have any kind of assists on it. Where they put in hydraulic supports and everything to help you. And the B-29 was the last one that you flew by hand. And of course it was heavy. And you just had to take hold of it. But when you're 23 years old and, gosh, you can do anything then. That doesn't mean anything. They can pull 2 engines on one side and, that age, you can do anything. It was really just another airplane. You just had to learn what to do and how to do it. Tinian. It's in the Marianas. It's right next to it's right next to Saipan, and about, I don't know, maybe 100 miles from Guam, north of Guam. And that's where we flew out of. The last attack on Tinian came about a month before I got there. And so there were still some Japanese who hadn't been captured, who'd be out in the cane fields and hiding out. And, but, we never had any problem with them. We had people walking guard, and we never had any problem with them. Now, when we stopped at Iwo, we were there 2 or 3 times. When we stay at Iwo overnight, we always had an arrangement made that if anything happened, we'd all jump out and lay on the ground feet to feet, see? And anything that moved in front of you, you shot it. Because they still had a lot of Japs running around there, and they as a matter of fact, they killed, I don't know, maybe 20 pilots in that P-51 outfit. They raided that P-51 outfit one night and killed about 20 pilots. So that's why whenever we were there and spent the night, we were always prepared to, who was going to lay where. And and shoot anything that you saw that moved. Try to shoot it. My weapon in the infantry was a 45 automatic. So and my crew, none of them had ever had it. And when they were issued before we went overseas, and I had to train or give them lessons of how to break down a 45 automatic because they'd never used them, never seen them, never fired them. So, but I had fired them quite a bit, and I think I was qualified expert on a 45 automatic, and you can't shoot them very far. You shoot more than 20, 30 feet, and you don't know where the bullets are going. But up close, of course, up close, boy, it's the weapon to have because it'll stop anything. We had the 313th Wing there, and then they built another airfield. Our airfield in the north end of the island at that time was the largest air base in the world. We had 4 almost 10,000 foot runways, and we could just put airplanes in the air, 4 at a time. The Seabees built the runways, and they built most everything there. And of course, they were real pros at construction, And when they first built them with the coral. They'd dig into the side of the hill there, and it was a coral atoll, is what the island was. And so we had these coral runways, but it wouldn't take much to get holes in the runways. So when we'd take off, we'd kind of lumber down there and back and forth in and out of those holes. But it didn't take long till they got the tar and made up asphalt out of I guess the coral, and paved those runways. Oh boy, were they nice and smooth. You could take off before you even got near the end of the runway. So we liked those Seabees. They had a ship that could repair anything, tires, anything. Well, those Seabees would go aboard a ship, and they'd pilfer a bunch of stainless steel trays that they ate on, and they'd make watch bands. And I'll show you this. I'll show you. This is the watch that we were issued watches, and when the war ended, they told us to keep them. And this band is made from a stainless steel tray, and they had all the equipment. They could cut all that stuff, and they put palm trees on it, and they'd put your name on it, and the Marianas Island. And I've had that ever since World War II. I took it up one time when I was going to go to a reunion. Took it up to a jeweler. I said, "Do you think you can get this thing going? It's pretty old." I said, "I got it in World War II." And he said, "Well, you're still going, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, we'll fix it." So he did, and it's been working ever since. So that's one of the things the Seabees did. So I think we'd pay them, we'd give them a bottle of whiskey. And then they built another base right to the south of us, and moved the 58th Wing in out of Calcutta. They'd been in Calcutta, and they'd fly over the hump into China, and they'd fly gasoline and bombs in, then they'd load them up, and it was a very unsuccessful operation. And General LeMay, they sent him over there in command, and the first thing he did was say, "Well, we've got to get out of here. We just can't get the job done." So they moved them over to Tinian. And then at that time, when they moved over, he became the commanding general of the 21st Bomber Command. And we were part of the 20th Air Force, 21st Bomber Command. They moved on our base, and they gave them the markings of the 6th Bomb Group, which is part of the 313th Wing. And General Tibbets, who I have since come to know slightly, was in command of that organization, and a friend of mine that I had flown with at Fort Myers, Florida, and was a real bright guy and was an aeronautical engineer. He became the engineering officer of that outfit. And they had both B-29s and they had constellations that they flew, so many dignitaries and scientists and, of course, senators and all kinds of people flying back and forth all the time. And they flew off of our base, but they kept to themselves, and we never got near them. They had their own area, and you couldn't get near it. I flew 28. I flew one with a friend of mine. They took all the airplane commanders, and they'd put you in with someone who'd flown a number before, and an old friend of mine, who I see once in a great while, I flew with him. I had flown with him at Fort Myers, Florida. And so I rode with him. Then the next 27, I was my own airplane commander. I flew different airplanes because I got there 2 months later than all my buddies. So I flew different airplanes all the time, excepting for one plane that I flew. My records show 13 times, but the official record is 12 times. And that airplane was the leading airplane, leading B-29 in the Pacific. No other B-29 ever flew 50 straight missions without ever aborting. When it went out, it made the trip. It wasn't very fast. It had been twisted a little bit, and sometimes the bombs wouldn't drop, and the bombardier would have to go back there with an axe and chop them out, chop the cables. And but the crew chief, General Spots, was commanding the 20th at that time, 21st Bomber Command, and he came up and gave my crew chief the Legion of Merit. Now the number one crew, the crew that took it over and flew 32 missions in it, they're the ones that set the record. But they finished their missions and went home. So the last 5 missions, when it set all the records and everything, I just happened to be the one that was flying it because I was the number 2 crew assigned to that plane. But it wouldn't have had that record if I'd had to fly all 50 of them, because they did a couple of things I don't think I would have done. Curly Claybo, of course, he didn't have a hair on his head. That's why they call him Curly. And he was an old master sergeant and an old crew chief. And Curly said, well, I talked to him about the tires, and he said, well, the tires we're getting in, they don't look like very good tires to me. I think we'll just keep these. Curly said, keep them. We kept them. Because Curly knew more about it than we did. So we listened to Curly. He knew what he was doing. Doing the work every day, that doesn't make good news.
That's right.
See, that doesn't make the news. It's so-and-so's out there and they dropped bombs, or they shot down these fighters, or the fighters shot down. That makes good stories. Well, poor old Joe out there in that hot airplane, fixing a radar set and nearly passing out because he's hot and tired in there, or out in the sun and he's sunburned, that doesn't make good stories. So they don't get credit like they should. But you can't operate without them. You just, one airplane would only last a matter of days, and there'd be something wrong with it. You couldn't fly it. So you have to have those guys have to be there. And they were, again, self-disciplined people. People knew what to do and how to do it, and did it. Our ground crews were super. They were super. An outfit can't operate without mechanics and instrument men and all that. You'd fold up shop in just a matter of days. So they never really were properly taken care of for the things they did. They certainly deserve more credit than they've ever gotten, because we couldn't operate without them. Now, my crew chief, of course, was well taken care of because he was given the Legion of Merit, and which is a high, one of the higher medals that you can earn, because of his airplane made 50 straight missions and never turned back. And my own crew, my flight crew, were They were very self-disciplined people, and bright people, dependable. I had absolutely no problems with my crew. They knew what to do and how to do it, and they did it. The navigator, he'd just throw wore a chest pack. He had everything on. All he had to do was just clamp it on like that. And the radio operator the same way, because they were working all the time. And the radio operator was very meticulous in keeping that chest pack just perfect. He never let it get dirty or anything. Well, the navigator, he'd kick it around, anything, you know. So we'd been hit pretty bad, and I didn't know whether we were going to make it or not, so I told them all to take their positions and get prepared to bail out. And so the navigator just turned around and grabbed the first chute he saw, and it was the radio operators. And the radio operator immediately tackled him, and they had a fight right there over that parachute. So, but the story got built up a little more than that. But basically, that's what happened. And he told him, "You bail out, you're going to have me wrapped right around you. When you bail out with my chute, because I'm not going to put on yours." They did pull one on me one time. See, we'd be those long missions, of course. In the fighters and that, when you use a relief tube, you just use it and it goes out the airplane. But on the B-29s, we had big cans that big around and that high that everybody used to relieve themselves. And I had it on our crew where everybody had to take their turns, officers and all, everybody took their turn. So the radio man says that my instructions were that the first guy that used it, he's the one who had to empty it. Well, again, that's not true. That's not the way it was. Everybody took their turn. I think he was telling Phil, he said, so we'd all just wait till Captain came back there and he'd have to go. Then we knew he'd have to empty it. See, the B-29s, our average mission was about 1,500 miles up to Japan and 1,500 back, of course. So we ran 3,000 to 32 or 300. On a few missions when I had a bombardier who had the best scores on bombing, and I had a navigator who was just a brilliant man. And so we would be sent across Japan to the river mouths after they had mined all the south side and everything. And we'd go across Japan and put mines into the mouths of the rivers. Now those were long missions because we had to go clear to the other side. They were also a little dangerous because we would play cat and mouse all the way across Japan with the anti-aircraft. You know, the lights would come on and start looking for you, and we'd drop chaff. It's aluminum foil and it's cut in strips, and it really gives a frequency when it drops out there, and the searchlights and the radar will immediately pick that up because it will throw out a much larger signal than just the plane would. We'd drop chaff and turn, and so we were just across Japan all the way. Then coming back would be the same thing. They never caught us, but it was a real cat and mouse game. We did so many night missions, and night missions were all individual aircraft, and only the daytime missions that were formation. I was a flight lead and what they call a pathfinder. I'd go in first at night and drop, and then the others would be maybe 5 minutes behind me, and the fires would be going, and they could drop on them. They just were not well constructed by our standards, and so they were subject to fire, and that's what General LeMay is the one that started the fire raids. Because he'd been in England and he knew the British, that's what they did. They didn't do high altitude precision bombing. They went in at night and fire raids and fire bombs. So he said, that's what we're going to do. Of course, instead of being at 28 or 30,000 feet, you're at 8, 10, or 12,000 feet. And so we always, the first time they told us that, well, you're going to be going in at 10,000 feet. And we all kind of looked at one another, you know. But, and we were all going to be going in alone. And we wondered how we were going to keep from running into one another, you know. And once in a while, you'd see on a night that wasn't too dark, and you looked, and there'd be one just going right, sliding right across the top of you, you know. But I don't know that anybody ever ran into anybody else. It was just, they just had them spaced enough that it worked. And then they still kid me about, we went across the target, and there wasn't too much flak. We went across the target, and only about half the bombs came out. So I told them, I said, well, we're just going to make like a practice run, like we did in practice. We'll just go around, and we'll go across that target again. Oh, you know. So that time we dropped them, and we still had one hanging. And the navigator said, you go around there again, I'm going to jump out of this thing. Which you couldn't have thrown him out. Of course, a lot of times they just crashed and were all killed. And sometimes if they'd get down in one piece, people would come out and kill them. And they had a number of prisoners in the Tokyo area, in a prisoner of war camp. And when the bombers hit on that big raid, we had two big raids. We burned out 16 square miles one night and 11 square miles on another night. Now, I was not on the 16 mile, I was on the 11 mile. But when they hit, they wouldn't unlock the doors for the prisoners, and all of the American prisoners died. So there were only 5% of those who were shot down or went down over Japan. Only 5% of them got back. 80-some% got back from German. We had one crew in our squadron that they got back, not our squadron, in our group. It was right at the end of the war, and Japanese people were ready to kill them, and some officer came up and stopped them. And it turned out that he was a Christian, one of the few people in Japan, you know, very few Christians. But his family had been converted to Christianity. And he stopped it and he saved their lives. And so they were some of those that were saved, but mostly they were killed or died in the crashes. We had some fighter resistance on most missions. The Japanese started to husband their fighters instead of sending them up. I had three men who got Purple Hearts, but they weren't serious wounds. They'd maybe miss a mission, and then they're more flesh wounds than anything else. So we were very fortunate, because those things are just all pure luck of if the shells happen to hit you or not. We got shot up pretty bad several times. Very few times that we didn't get some holes of some kind. I think one time we had 80-some holes, and one time the main wing spar was almost severed. I don't know how it held together. Another time we had an engine, we had a fire in it, and I don't know how it went out, but it went out. And the bomb bays were all torn up, and most times we'd have some damage of some kind. But we landed at Okinawa on that one. No, at Iwo Jima. When you're shot up bad, you work harder at it because you know you might have a problem. So you just crank it down tighter, and you make sure that you don't do something wrong. So no, it was never any better or any worse from that, but you do try harder. I thought at first that that one would just be shoved off into the ocean, but they looked it over, and they put new bomb bay doors on it. The bomb bay doors were just all torn to shreds. They put new bomb bay doors on it, and they put patches on the holes, and I think about 2 weeks, we went back up and Ewell and picked up that airplane and took it home. Of course, the kamikazes, when they started, we didn't know what they were. All we'd see at night was what we called a ball of fire. The ball of fire was a kamikaze, a jet plane. And what they would do, they'd take them up in a Betty bomber and turn them loose, and they'd just find the exhaust stacks, and they'd just drive right into the exhaust stacks. And you'd see things blow up, and once in a while, and one of the men in our squadron, Jones, started the same thing. He said, there's a ball of fire on my tail, and we never saw him again. So one night we were cruising along, and we just dropped our bombs, we're heading out, and the tail gunner said, there's a ball of fire on our tail. I had figured what I was going to do if that ever happened to me. So I started letting down. I got up to the max speed, and he was still gaining on us, and I had told the gunners, do not fire at that ball of fire, because I thought maybe it was something that would blow up. But I also knew that if it was flying around in the air, it had to be governed by the laws of aerodynamics, the same as I was. So I had it all set with a co-pilot, and so we made a real tight turn, and we knew that we might tear the airplane up, but what difference it make? We were going to be gone anyhow. So we made this tight turn, and we crossed control to keep it flat and try to turn like this. When we made the turn, that blanked out his sight, and he didn't know what happened. I mean, once he couldn't see us, and so he just kept right on going. And the ball of fire went past the tail, and of course the guys are all jumping and yelling. So when I told people about it, I said, we returned to normal flight. Sweaty and soiled. When you're 23 years old, you wouldn't admit you were scared. No matter what happened, no guy would ever admit he was frightened, And even though the hair's standing up on the back of your neck, why, you still would never admit to that. You're just cool, calm, and our historian who prepared this book called me just a few weeks ago and said there was some English company that was putting together a book, and he remembered my telling the story one time. And he wanted to know, could they use that story in this English book they were getting out? So I told him, sure. I remember one time, there's a phenomenon, a weather phenomenon, called St. Elmo's fire. And on ships is where they first saw it. And it's a little blue flame that'll just dance between two pieces of metal on the flame. And it just looks like a blue flame buzzing back and forth. And of course in airplanes you see it every once in a while, usually from something sticking out of the nose and then bounce back against the body of the plane. One night we were coming home from Japan, and that St. Elmo's fire started, and it started more and more until finally the whole nose was engulfed with that bluish flame and all four propellers. It's the most eerie sight. We knew that it wasn't dangerous, but a sight that eerie, and I've never seen or heard of that before or since. But the whole nose of the airplane was just covered with that blue flame and all four propellers. One of our guys flew the weather ship the day that the bomb was dropped. He flew the weather ship and told him it was clear over Hiroshima, and they dropped. We had no idea. They didn't tell us anything. We didn't know any more than was in the papers. 2 days later, my group went to a city, and I forget the name of it. They weren't moving fast enough. They dropped that atomic bomb. The Japanese weren't rolling over and playing dead. And we made a turn at Hiroshima and bombed a city right east of Hiroshima. But our formation was terrible because all we did, everybody was looking at Hiroshima. And I was a flight leader, and of course my two wingmen were, well, I don't know just where they were. Were all flying the same general direction the same time of day. It wasn't really a formation. But we got to see Hiroshima, and it was a stark. There were some rather low, few-story reinforced concrete buildings that were still standing. And they looked so stark sitting out there, kind of white, and everything was black and wisps of smoke coming up all over the place. It was a pretty desolate looking sight. And then we went on over and got our formation together and went on over and bombed the city and then went home. So that was an interesting experience. If you had gone to Osaka or Nagoya or Tokyo and seen them a few days after we had had those big raids, they looked the same way. But this was all done with just one bomb and one plane, while the others were done with several hundred planes. But they looked the same. They were all burnt out and looked pretty bad. The Japanese, have never been successfully invaded. In about 1280, Kublai Khan decided he was going to take Japan. He had everything else. And he had 1,500 ships in one battle fleet and 3,500 in another. And the 1,500 fleet came over to the west coast of Kyushu, landed, went up the hill, and the Japanese attacked, and they came right back down the hill and out to their boats, what was left of them. Then the rest of them, they all got together and went over on the east side. And before they could, this is about 1280, before they could attack and make the landing, along came the divine wind, the kamikaze. That's where they get the divine wind, and destroyed the fleet of Kublai Khan. The invasion of Japan and Kyushu was to start, I believe it was the first day of November. Well, on October the 8th, you can imagine how many ships would have been at Okinawa. Oilers and supply ships and troop ships and all kinds of battleships. And this horrendous typhoon hit the island of Okinawa, went out to sea, turned around, came right back across Okinawa. It is the worst disaster that ever hit the United States Navy. They lost just dozens and dozens of capital ships, destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, battleships. Worst disaster, natural disaster that ever struck them. But just the euphoria of the war being over, and there were a few planes and a few ships lost. Nobody thought anything of it. If it were in a paper, there wasn't much. And it just kind of went over everybody's head, and nobody thought anything of it. But that was a terrible storm that hit Okinawa. So what if that invasion fleet had been there? There would not have been an invasion. The Japanese, also the plan that they had was a very good plan, and American generals now know that it would have been a nip and tuck fight to stay ashore. If they got ashore, it would have been, and not only that, but the Japanese were prepared to send women and children in against the Americans. Now, there aren't very many American boys who are going to stand there and kill off a bunch of women and children. And the Japanese soldiers behind them, it would have been nip and tuck. What they don't realize is the Japanese were prepared. They would have had air superiority over the landing site. Nobody believes that. But we could not have put 15,000 airplanes over that landing site on Kyushu. But they could. American intelligence missed it badly. They thought that we had shot down all those Japanese fighters, but we hadn't. they were keeping them under cover and under wraps for the invasion. And they figured that by the time the invasion came, the Japanese would have 15,000 aircraft. We couldn't have put up anyways near that, and they couldn't have stayed. See, the Air Force fighters would have come out of Okinawa, and they would be about the limit. They couldn't stay over the site more than a half hour. They'd have to go back. Then what would President Truman do if he had 3, 4, or 5? See, we know he had 3 atomic bombs because 3 of them were brought to the island of Tinian. So I don't know how many more they had, but at least they had the 3. So what would he have done then? Well, he would not have dropped them on a little place like Hiroshima. They would have gone after the big cities, and they would have been out to destroy them. If they had 10 atomic bombs, they'd have used all 10 of them. You know, that's just human nature that a leader would have to do that, because he would have had to say, no, you can't drop the first one, and then have the invasion come like it did. See, it would have been a different thing entirely. So it saved millions of lives, mostly Japanese. We got it announcements over the loudspeakers and all, and I was at a movie, and they said the war was over. Well, those crazy Marine anti-aircraft guys, they started shooting those anti-aircraft up in the air, and we were in far more danger of being hit from the fragments coming back down than we were from the Japanese. There were quite a few parties that night. I was sent right during that interim period where nobody knew who had decided to quit and who had. In some places the Japanese quit, in some places they didn't. And I was sent over to Hong Kong and a little place north of Hanoi. And I had prisoner of war supplies, and I had cameras aboard. And there was a typhoon between the Marianas and the Philippines. So they told me to go to Okinawa and wait there till the typhoon got close and then take out. But they said, don't cross Formosa, Taiwan. Don't cross that because the Japanese are still shooting. So we headed for Amoy, China, and went down the coast and got to Hong Kong. And here was the British fleet steaming into Hong Kong. An impressive sight. I had flown across the top of the 58th Task Force and the 54th Task Force, but it was at night and never saw anything. See? But here's that big British task force moving in. So we were back and forth and took the pictures. I never saw the pictures because that stuff's all sealed, and the camera people, when you land, they come out and get all the cameras and take care of that. But we took the photo coverage of the British fleet going into Hong Kong. So I went over in March, the middle of March, and then I came home the 1st of November. And so I wasn't there very long. I got back in the middle of November of 45. I immediately went down to Columbus, to Ohio State, signed up, and started there. I think the 3rd of January, I started to Ohio State, and 3 years later, I graduated with a degree in foreign commerce. And I had gone to New York to go, and I talked to IBM, and they weren't sending people out. So, I think I'll go in the oil business. My uncles had all been in the oil business. My grandfather was in the oil business there in Ohio. So I went down to Tulsa, and I got a job with Carter Oil. And Carter Oil is now ExxonMobil. They were a wholly owned subsidiary of Standard New Jersey. And I went through an 8-month training program with them, executive training program. And after I finished that, I was in the South, in Shreveport, and they thought I was a little too liberal. And so they needed me there, but they sent me to Denver. They got rid of me. They did. That's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, was they sent me to Denver. And in 1956, I bought a house in Broomfield, 289 Flint Way. All three of my sons went all the way through school there. And I was I was on the school board when it was the Broomfield, just the Broomfield district. And we spent a lot of our time trying to get Boulder County made into one school district. We ended up with two districts. It didn't grow too fast. It could keep up with itself. And now, of course, with all the growth, I suppose they have problems, a lot more problems than they used to have. But that's right. It didn't grow nearly as fast as people thought it would. And I was one of those that thought it'd grow fast. I was very glad it didn't, because I traveled a lot as an oil man. I was traveling a lot, and it was nice and small. I had three little boys there and a wife, so I was glad it didn't get big. I'm not one of those that thinks you can just shut everything down. I think you can have spaces, but you have to compensate those people who have that land that on both sides of them, high-priced land because of development, and they're sitting out in the middle, and they say nobody can develop it, so of course they have inexpensive land. That's not proper. They have to be compensated. I think it was essential that it become a county. 4 counties in one city, that's ridiculous. So it was made into the county, and I was all in favor of that. And I was a lease broker until, I don't know, 20 years ago or 15 years ago probably. And I just gradually retired. And when the bottom fell out of the oil business, I said, well, this is a good time to quit. No need to send good money after bad, so I just retired. Until 1955, I believe it was, I flew in the reserves. And mostly they had AT-6s for us to fly. But since then, I've just flown light airplanes. And I'd go for years and never fly, and then get a physical and start in again. And this last go-around, I didn't have anything else to do, so I'd go out and watch them build DIA and fly around out there. I had to stop flying about when I was 72. I stopped. I'm not like the guy up in Longmont. Did you see in the paper this morning, 99 years old? 99 years old, and it was his birthday the other day, and he went flying. The rest of the guys didn't go because it's too much crosswind. That's all right with him. He's 99. He used to fly on his birthday, so he flew on his 99th birthday. That's something to be physically able to do it. My hearing got such that I could not understand what the tower said. So I was shooting landings. I flew out of Erie, Tri-County. And I was over at Jeffco and shot a landing and went down and took off. And apparently they told me to clear right. And I cleared left, heading back to Erie. And they got after me a little, and that's all. And I get thinking about it. I've been flying here for 50-some years now. I've never been reprimanded. I've never been written up. Now, if I've got any sense at all, I'll just go land this thing and quit. So that's what I did. And I've never flown since. I see a lot of bright young people who they're intelligent, they're trustworthy, they're good citizens. I think everything's fine. Now, we have bad ones, but we've always had bad ones. And as a matter of fact, the West was built by a lot of bad people who came out here because they were run out from where they were. But my goodness, I'm encouraged. I think everything's fine. It can be a lot better, and I wish we could figure some way to get away from the drug business. If we could just do that, I think our problems would be over. But I've got a lot of questions, but I don't have very many answers. I've never been to Japan, and I don't intend to go to Japan. You know, they just did their job, just like we were doing our job. but I don't feel that I need to discuss it with them. And so I've never looked one of them up. Well, our first reunion was just 13 years ago. So it would have been 87. Yeah, it had been, no, 88, I guess, was our first reunion. Everybody looked different, and they all looked like old people. And, but, we got to know one another again, and we had a good time. Our bomb group had about 2,200. And we have found about half of them. And, of course, most of them are deceased. But we had just about 125. There were probably 300 people there. Like I took my son or asked him if he'd go. And a lot of people had relatives with them this time. In our group, the one thing we've worked on is to get the ground personnel to come to these reunions. And we now have a bunch of them that come to it. And, they were there and it's hot and sweaty and they had to get in those hot airplanes and work on them or be outside in the sun working on the engines outside. We've had a lot of fun at those reunions. But we're all getting pretty old, and so we disbanded our organization last year, and we now have a professional outfit that's going to put one on in Wichita. But I had kept track, and I'd seen all of my crew members at some time or another. I'd seen all of them since the war. My radar operator is still alive. The left blister gunner is still alive. The radio man is still alive. The navigator is still alive, and I'm still alive. 5 out of the 11. When we go to those, we don't talk much about what went on. Oh, somebody has some story that they tell, and we'd all laugh at them because that's not the way we remembered it. So we don't talk much about the missions. They used to tell war stories. And everybody would sit there, and a guy would tell the story just like he's talking to strangers, like we weren't there and saw it. And, that's not the way I remember it. And so that's what everybody would say, They finally got to the place. I never would tell one of those war stories because if it's like this, the bombardier's sitting in the front looking that way. The tail gunner's sitting in the rear looking that way. Now, on any one mission, you ask the bombardier and the tail gunner to write down the story of that mission. They're going to have two different stories, aren't they? Some say, no, that wasn't that way. It was thus and so. Hey, we can't even agree among ourselves what went on. So the bombardier sat here. The navigator sat behind. But the bombardier sat here. And you can see that's the wheel right up there from 1944 and 1945. I was an airplane commander, the 9th bomb group.
You don't look that old.
Well, I'm 80, so I'm old.
You sure don't look like it.
I've been lucky, I guess.
That bomb site, Tennessee Ernie Ford donated that to the Confederate Air Force.
Is that right?
He was a bombardier in World War II on these.
That's a tunnel.
Oh, that's
it's a
the one
tunnel
they
that goes from the front can to the rear can.
Okay. I
You
saw a
have to
picture
climb
of
through
that.
it. I couldn't climb through it now.
Oh, it's pretty good size. I don't think we could get the tail gun anymore.
We can carry 40 500-pounders.
40.
40
Double.
10. They're right. R-3350s. 2,200 horsepower engines. They're, big, powerful engines. But by the end of the war, they had all the problems worked out, and they just had perfect engines. The first 10 times I flew in a B-29, I only got back on the ground with all 4 engines running twice. That's not a very good percentage.
Our early problems with them was electrical.
Had a lot of electrical problems, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't. I don't remember any
They
electrical
probably
problems.
solved that in the B-24.
Yeah, because we didn't have electrical
Because
problems.
that's out over the Pacific. That's why way we lost them was electrical.
Ours
we
were
were
engines.
flying once, and we lost all 4 engines at once. But we were about 20,000, so by the time we got down to 10, we had them
Had them running again.
Had 'em running again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we didn't have electrical problems. We just had engine problems. We started out with a 20 millimeter in the tail. But, you know, you couldn't carry enough ammunition, it doesn't fire very fast, and 250 calibers would do just as much damage to a Jap fighter as a 20 millimeter would. I mean, they'd knock them down just as fast. You know, these are gun sights,
Yeah.
remote control gun sights.
Are they remote control?
Yeah, they're remote control gun sights. See, there's a turret,
Where's the gunner?
and up there's a turret, and the gunner sits right there. And then on top you had a turret, and then up front you had a 4-gun turret. And these are all remote control. And the
boy,
guy
that
up
would've
there
been
in the
great.
center, he could switch them around. Wherever the
Wherever
fighters
wanted
were
the
coming
fighters.
from, he could throw the guns to that side. And but these were the first remote control ones, and they had a thing, and then they'd get them on the wingtips, push the buttons, and then
Well, that's something that we didn't have.
Yeah.
Our top turrets worked good. Our bottom turret worked good. Tail turret worked good. I mean, to hit a plane. But the guns, we had 2 guns on each side, and then 1 more in the nose, and we couldn't hit anything.
Okay.
I got started with the wrong foot. I got up to the top. Couldn't get my knee bent.
this is the radio operator's seat.
You want to sit there?
Yeah, that's where I'm used to sitting.
Oh, okay.
I sat there for about 1,000 hours.
We had one pilot, he was flying along and had a burst of flak. In combat, this airplane flew with a crew of 11. There were 6 up front and 5 in the rear. Pilot sat here, co-pilot here, bombardier sat down here. He's got a cushion underneath of this that he sits on, and it's not all that uncomfortable. He didn't have to sit on that wood or the bare metal or anything. Down below up front is the old Norden bomb site, very top secret in the first part of World War II. I guess after a while they had enough B-17s and B-24s that crashed in Germany that the Germans actually had the bomb site. But by that time they were more on the defensive than they were on the offensive.
My last 3 missions, I led flights of almost 500 airplanes.
Is that right? Yeah, I guess they're rattling our cage, telling us they want us to get out. Yeah, these.
Step to the rear there.
Very interesting.
Well, thank you.
Yes, enjoyed it. Enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
Guys like this.
What kind of memories does that bring back to you?
Well, the color brings back the deserts in North Africa. If you can see the bulkhead in there, there was a desk that dropped down. And I sit at the desk and in the bomb sight like this, and the bombardier's on his knees at the bomb site. Later, some of my missions, they had a turret on the front. And in those, the navigator couldn't hardly see anything. The pilots really like to get in the lead, get to be lead because, navigators did too, but pilots liked it because then the navigator would take over the automatic pilot and he just controlled the speed and kept the formation going right. Tail end Charlies were the tough places to fly.
Oh, yeah. You had to put on so much power to catch up and then pull it clear back. And every time they changed.
In the air that I was flying, the first mission, the tail enders would get very apt to get shot down because these are boxcars to hold bombs. It looks a lot bigger here without the bomb bays. The bomb bay trail you walked between was about 8 inches wide. In a bomber, this is the widest part of it right here for moving around because the bomb bay doors are up there in that wide part. Four officers and 6 enlisted men. Well, the instruments in the cockpit is all the same.
Well, they've done some changes to these too.
This pedestal is not the same.
And she's still going good.
Yeah. Those are Pratt Whitney engines.
Pratt & Whitney's, yes sir, 1830s.
I always say if there's 15 people standing there around you, there'll be 21 different opinions.
You're clear.
That old gentleman up there in the cockpit,
I bet.
that old man's got tears in his eyes.
It's bigger than you thought it was.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a real boxcar.
Look at this. It's a 110-foot wing.
Oh, yeah.
There's no tail turret. There's no ball turret. There's no upper turret.
Yeah. I did see one up
And there
front.
was no. See, the one they flew in combat, they were B-24Js, H's and J's. This is a B-24D or E. See, we'd have to, for us to get up there, we'd have to open the bomb bays, cool it down, get underneath the bomb door, they crawl up on a catwalk and go in. If we wanted to get at the back door, because the height of it off the ground, we'd get up underneath the nose, right by the tail wheel, get underneath there and raise our back, and we put the thing back on the tail skid. That's where they got tail skid there. And that put the tail skid down, and you get in it, and you can climb it through.
She's the tour leader of her.
You could chin up on them. You know what I mean? They were just rock hard.
Hey, Floyd. Come over this side. I don't know what you're calling up. Yeah. Well,